spotted my daughter through the window of a Tim Hortons on Barrington Street, and for a second I thought I had the wrong person. She was sitting alone at a corner table, hunched over, counting change, not looking through her wallet for a card, counting coins, stacking them on the tabletop one by one, the way my grandchildren do when they're saving up for something at the dollar store. My daughter is 36 years old. She has a university degree. She had a job she loved. I stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, and I watched her for longer than I should have. She had a paper cup in front of her, the smallest size, and she was wearing a jacket I didn't recognize. Thin. Not a jacket for Halifax in November. She looks like she lost weight, and not the healthy kind. I pushed open the door. She looked up when she heard the bell, and the expression on her face, just for a half second before she caught herself, was something I'll never forget. It was shame. Pure, naked shame. And then it was gone, replaced by a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and she swept the coins off the table into her palm, like she was hoping I hadn't seen. I had seen. I sat down across from her, and I put my hands flat on the table, and I said, "Where's your car?" She blinked. "In the shop." "Which shop?" "Up, just a place near the house." "It's fine, Mum. What are you doing downtown?" "I had a dental appointment on Spring Garden." "What are you doing downtown? Aren't you supposed to be at work?" She said she had a half day. She said everything was fine. She said she was just killing time before her husband picked her up. I looked at the coin still closed in her fist, and I said, "Were you counting that to see if you could afford another coffee?" She opened her mouth, closed it, and then very quietly she said, "It's been a tight month." Now, my daughter and her husband had been together for 4 years, married for 2. They had a house in Dartmouth, a nice one, a semi-detached on a street with old maples, and they both worked. She was a dental hygienist. He worked in fleet management for a logistics company. They didn't have children yet, though she'd told me they were thinking about it. By any reasonable accounting, they should have been comfortable. Not rich. Nobody in Halifax is rich right now, but comfortable. Groceries without looking at prices, comfortable. 2 incomes, comfortable. A tight month. I didn't push her. I know my daughter. If you push her, she goes quiet, and she digs in, and then you've lost her for weeks. I bought her a large coffee and a sandwich because she said she wasn't hungry, but she ate the whole thing in about 4 minutes, and we talked about nothing. My garden, her sister's new apartment in Calgary, whether the Mooseheads were going to have a decent season. Normal things, safe things. But I drove home with my hands tight on the steering wheel, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time after. Something was wrong. I didn't know what yet, but I knew. My daughter's name I'll keep to myself. She's asked me not to use it, so I'll call her by what I've always called her at home, my girl. And her husband, I'll call him what he is, a man I should never have trusted. His mother, I'll call her the woman, because that's about as generous as I can be right now. I'd never warmed to him, if I'm honest. He was charming in that particular way that makes you feel stupid for not liking someone. He remembered your birthday. He held doors. He laughed at all the right moments. My late husband used to say, "Watch how a man treats his mother." I watched. He treated his mother like she was the center of the solar system, which sounds sweet until you understand what that actually means. She called twice a day. She had opinions about everything, where they bought furniture, what they ate, where they went on vacation. My girl used to laugh it off. "She's just involved," she'd say. "It's a cultural thing." I bit my tongue. It wasn't my place. But I remembered things, little things that hadn't seemed important at the time. The week before the wedding, my girl had mentioned, almost in passing, that his mother thought they should combine finances completely. One account, everything pooled. His mother had done the same in her own marriage, she said, and it had worked beautifully. My girl seemed uncertain about it. I told her it was her choice, her marriage, her business. I should have said more. I didn't hear from her for 3 weeks after I saw her at Tim Hortons. I texted. She replied with short answers. Fine. Busy. Works crazy. The usual deflection. I drove past her house on a Tuesday afternoon on the pretense of dropping off a bag of apples from the farmer's market, and nobody answered the door. The lights were off. Her car, a 2019 Subaru Outback that she'd saved for 2 years to buy, was not in the driveway. His truck was there. I set the apples on the step and I stood on the sidewalk and I looked at that house. Something about it felt wrong. The blinds were closed in the middle of the day. The garden she'd always kept up was overgrown. There was a stack of flyers in the mailbox that hadn't been cleared in at least a week. I went home and I called her sister. Her sister hadn't spoken to her in a month either. I called her best friend from university, a woman I've known since my girl was 19. She said she hadn't seen her since the summer. I keep trying, she said, but she's always got an excuse. There was a pause. I've been worried. That was enough for me. I'm 63 years old. I am a retired high school vice principal. I spent 30 years managing crises, kids in trouble, parents in denial, staff in conflict. I know how to be methodical. I know how to gather information before I act. And I knew that if I called my girl and accused her husband of something I couldn't prove, she would defend him and I would lose my access to her entirely. So I did not call. I watched. I started driving past the house in the mornings before work hours. Her Subaru was never there. His truck was almost always there, or sometimes a different vehicle, a newer SUV I didn't recognize. I noted the plates. I noted the times. One morning, I saw her come out to the front door at 7:15. She was wearing her work scrubs, which meant she was going to the clinic. She walked to the end of the block, and she stood on the corner. I pulled over half a street away, and I waited. 7 minutes later, a city bus came, and she got on it. She was taking the bus to work. In November. In Halifax. While her car sat, who knows where. I followed the bus, which I'm not proud of, but I followed it. She got off on Queen Street, walked 2 blocks, went into the dental clinic where she worked. Fine, she was safe. But I sat in my car and I thought, why is she taking the bus? Where is her car? And why hasn't she told me any of this? I went home and I did something I hadn't done since my girl was a teenager. I called her workplace. Not to speak to her. I asked to speak to the office manager, a woman I'd met once at a clinic open house. I explained that I was her mother, that I was concerned about her well-being, and I asked, carefully, whether she seemed all right at work. There was a pause, and then the office manager said quietly, I've been concerned too. She's been coming in looking tired. Last week she asked if she could get her direct deposit changed. She said she needed to open a new account. I don't know the details, but she seemed frightened. Frightened. I hung up and I sat very still for a long time. Then I called a lawyer. I want to be clear. I did not go in with accusations. I went in with questions. I sat across from a family law in a bright office on Gottingen Street, and I said, hypothetically, if someone's pay was being deposited into a joint account they had no practical access to, and their vehicle was being used by someone else without their consent, and they appeared to be isolated from family and friends, what would that look like, legally? She looked at me over her glasses. It looks like financial abuse, she said, and possibly coercive control, which in Canada, since Bill C-247 passed, is being taken increasingly seriously. She told me what to document. She told me what evidence would be useful. She told me that if my daughter came to her voluntarily, there were options: legal aid, emergency protection orders, mechanisms to freeze joint assets while a situation was assessed. I drove home and I made a list. Getting proof meant getting access, and getting access meant my girl had to let me in. I couldn't force that, but I could create an opportunity. I called her and I said I needed help. I told her my back had gone out, which wasn't entirely a lie. It had been bothering me, and I asked if she could come by on Saturday morning to help me move some boxes in the basement. I said her husband was welcome too. She came alone. She looked worse than she had at Tim Hortons, thinner. The jacket was still wrung for the weather. She had small, dark circles under her eyes that foundation couldn't quite cover. She hugged me in the doorway, and I felt her shoulder blades like two folded wings. I made tea and we sat at the kitchen table, and I did not ask her anything for the first 20 minutes. I talked about her aunt who was visiting from Moncton. I talked about the property tax increase on my house. Normal things. Safe things. And then, while I was refilling her cup, I said very casually, "How's the Subaru holding up? I was thinking about getting a pre-trip inspection done on my Civic. Wondered if you had a mechanic you liked." A beat. I haven't been driving much," she said. "Why not?" Another beat. Longer. We just, we find it easier if he uses the Subaru. His truck has been unreliable." "How long has it been unreliable?" She wrapped both hands around her mug. "A while." "How long is a while?" She didn't answer right away, and in that silence I heard everything I needed to hear. "6 months," she finally said. 6 months. My daughter had been without her own vehicle for 6 months. She had been taking the bus to work, and she hadn't told me. I put my hand over hers. I didn't say anything dramatic. I just held her hand and waited. It came out slowly, the way these things always do, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece more awful than the last, and with long silences between them where she'd stop and stare at her tea, like she was deciding whether to trust me. 3 years ago, shortly after they bought the house, his mother had suggested they consolidate their finances. One joint account. All income deposited there, all bills paid from there. He'd framed it as efficiency. She'd agreed, she told me, because she didn't want to seem like she was keeping secrets. She thought it was romantic, even. Building something together. Within 8 months, she no longer had a bank card that worked. He told her hers had been flagged for fraud, that the bank had cancelled it, that he'd ordered a replacement. The replacement never came. Any cash she needed, she asked him for. He gave her what he thought she needed, grocery money sometimes. Transit money, nothing extra. She had direct deposit. Her whole salary, close to 65,000 a year, went into that account. She hadn't had independent access to it in over 2 years. When I heard that number, I had to close my eyes for a moment. She kept talking. She told me about the house. They'd bought it together. She had money from her grandmother's estate, 40,000, which had gone toward the down payment. Her name was on the mortgage. But the property management, the bills, the insurance, the line of credit, was all in his name or managed by him. She had no passwords. She had no statements. She didn't know what their line of credit balance was. When she'd asked, he told her she didn't need to worry about it. He had, at some point in the past year, taken on a rental property with his mother, a condo unit somewhere, she didn't know exactly where. They were collecting rent. She didn't know how much. She had not been consulted. She had not been consulted. She had not been offered any portion of the income. She still had her job, which I think was the thing that saved her. But he had started showing up at her workplace once or twice a week to bring her lunch, he said, which her colleagues found thoughtful. She knew he was checking, making sure she was there, making sure she wasn't talking to anyone. "Why didn't you tell me?" I said. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was very small. "Because he told me that if I ever talked to you about our finances, he would tell you that I had a gambling problem, that I'd run up debts he'd had to cover, that he'd been protecting me from myself." She looked up. "And I know you would never believe that, but he's convincing. And I was afraid of what it would do to how you saw me. I think about that a lot, how much energy she spent being afraid of things that would never have happened." "Your father and I paid off our mortgage together," I said. "He showed me every statement. We argued about every major purchase. I never once in 32 years of marriage felt like I needed permission to buy groceries. I kept my voice level. What he's been doing has a name, and there are laws about it." She started crying then. Not dramatically. She's not a dramatic person, but quietly, the way you cry when you've been holding something for so long that the release is almost involuntary. I let her cry. I made more tea. And then I told her what I'd already done and what I thought we should do next. The lawyer on Gottingen Street had an opening on Monday. I'd already half booked it. My girl just needed to say yes. She said yes. We spent most of that Saturday going through what she knew and what she could access. She had nothing, no bank statements, no property documents, not even a copy of her own mortgage agreement. But she had her pay stubs, going back to when she'd started at the clinic. Because the clinic emailed them, and they'd been going to an old email address he didn't know about. 3 years of pay stubs, showing her full salary, deposited to an account she'd had no real access to. That was something. She also, it turned out, had photos. Not deliberately, she'd been cleaning her phone a few months ago and had found pictures she'd taken of some documents when he'd left them on the kitchen table. Tax forms, the rental agreement for the condo unit, which listed both him and his mother as landlords. She hadn't known why she'd saved them. She'd just had a feeling. I could have kissed her for that feeling. The lawyer on Monday was thorough and calm and did not make my girl feel stupid, which I had been afraid of. She explained the process clearly. Because my girl's name was still on the mortgage, she had legal standing to demand full financial disclosure as part of a separation proceeding. Because the direct deposit situation could be documented, the withholding of funds could be characterized as financial abuse under the Family Law Act. The rental income earned during the marriage, even if she hadn't known about it, was technically a matrimonial asset subject to equalization. We filed for separation the following Thursday. He didn't see it coming. I don't think it occurred to him that she had resources. I don't think it occurred to him that her quiet, retired mother had already spoken to a lawyer, already documented his patterns, already made copies of everything my girl had on her phone. He assumed that because she had no money, she had no options. He was wrong about that. His own lawyer apparently told him the rental income disclosure was the worst part for his case. Collecting rent on a property during a marriage, without disclosing it to your spouse, while simultaneously restricting her access to the joint account. That was not a position that looks good in front of a family court judge. The process took 4 months. It was not pleasant. He tried the gambling story with his own family, and it got back to us, which we'd expected. He tried to claim the 40,000 from my girl's grandmother's estate had been a gift to him specifically, which her aunt, bless her, was perfectly willing to appear in court to refute. His mother wrote a letter saying my girl had always been financially irresponsible, which the pay stubs made rather difficult to support. In the end, he signed over full interest in the house to my girl, returned the Subaru, which had 12,000 more kilometers on it than when he'd taken it, agreed to repay a negotiated portion of the salary he'd controlled, and was removed from all joint accounts. The condo rental property was sold, and my girl received her share of the equity. She moved back into her own house on a Thursday afternoon in March. I helped her carry boxes. Her best friend came. Her sister flew in from Calgary. Didn't even ask if she should, just booked the flight and showed up. We ordered Lebanese from a place on Portland Street, and we sat on the floor of her half-empty living room, and we ate, and we laughed, and we cried a little. She told me later that the moment she knew she was going to be all right was when she unlocked her own front door with her own key and nobody else was there, just her. Her house. Her key. Nobody to ask. I thought a lot about what I could have done differently, whether I should have said something earlier, when she first mentioned the combined finances, when I noticed she seemed to be shrinking, when she stopped calling as often as she used to. I don't know. Maybe. But I also know that she had to get to a place where she could say yes to help. You can't pull someone out of something they're not ready to leave. All you can do is be there, watching, waiting to move the moment they reach out a hand. She reached out a hand in a Tim Hortons on Barrington Street, and I was there. That's what mothers are for. I keep coming back to the coins, the way she swept them off that table before I could see how many there were. That one gesture, small, quick, ashamed, told me more than 6 months of short text messages ever had. I don't think what happened to my daughter was random. I think it happened in steps so gradual she didn't feel each one as it landed. He didn't take her car on day one. He didn't empty her account on day one. He built it slowly, a suggestion about combined finances here, a delay on her bank card there, a reason she shouldn't worry about the statements, a reason she shouldn't bother her mother with things that were fine, really, just a tight month. By the time she was standing at a bus stop in November, in the jacket too thin for Halifax, she'd been so thoroughly convinced that this was just her life now, that she wasn't even sure it was wrong. That's what I've had to sit with. Not anger, though there was plenty of that, but the understanding that cruelty doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just moves in quietly and rearranges the furniture until you can't remember where anything used to be. What I know now, after everything, is that she got out because of three things, and none of them were luck. The first was that she had never fully stopped being herself. Even in the worst of it, she kept her job. She kept that old email address he didn't know about. She took pictures of documents sitting on the kitchen table because something in her, some quiet, stubborn instinct for self-preservation, told her to. That's not nothing. That's a person who hasn't given up on herself, even when she's telling herself she has. Integrity doesn't disappear under pressure. It goes underground. And when she needed it, it was still there. The second was that she was willing to think clearly in a moment of enormous pain. When she sat at my kitchen table and I told her what I'd already done, the lawyer, the documentation, the plan, she didn't collapse into it or resist it. She thought. She asked questions. She pulled out her phone and showed me things she'd saved without knowing why. That kind of clear-headedness in a crisis isn't something you're born with. It's something you've practiced every time you've chosen to understand a hard situation rather than just survive it. The third was that she said yes when I offered help. That sounds simple. It wasn't. She'd spent 2 years being told in 100 small ways that her judgment couldn't be trusted. Saying yes to me meant deciding, against everything she'd been conditioned to believe, that she was worth the effort. That took more courage than anything else in this whole story. I think about the women who don't have a mother who happens to walk past a Tim Hortons window on the right Tuesday in November. I think about them a lot. And I think the only answer, the only real one, is that we have to build lives where the people around us feel safe enough to reach out before it gets that far, where the shame of asking for help is smaller than the shame of suffering in silence. She's in her house now, her key, her name on the deed, her Subaru in the driveway, with new tires she chose herself. That's enough. That's everything.